On the morning that changed everything, Imani Caldwell wore a pale green cardigan to work. She had bought it 8 years earlier at the Goodwill on Metropolitan Parkway for $4.50. It was thin at the elbows, soft from many washings. She wore it on job interviews and on first days, and when she needed to feel like she had put in some effort, it was the nicest thing she owned on a Tuesday. She did not know, when she zipped it on over her uniform at 6:58 that morning, that she would give it away before noon. She would not get it back for 7 years. And when she did, it would be inside a glass display case with a gold nameplate. He had been leaving money on that table for 22 years. $5,000 in cash, fanned out just enough that a few bills curled over the edge of the envelope, deliberate as a trap and designed to look accidental. He would lower himself into the burgundy leather armchair by the fireplace, pull his eyes shut, and breathe slow and heavy. He had the performance memorized the way an old actor memorizes a role he has played too many times without thinking, without effort, with something close to grief. His name was Wendell Beaumont. He was 72 years old. He had built Beaumont Transport Group from a borrowed truck and a route nobody else wanted, and he had driven that route himself for 11 years before the company went big enough to need a boardroom. He owned 3 private planes, a house in the Buckhead section of Atlanta that sat behind iron gates on 4.7 acres, and a reputation that made other men careful when they walked into a room he occupied. And yet, that money on the table, that $5,000 lying there, deliberate and unguarded, because Wendell Beaumont had stopped believing in people a very long time ago, and he kept proving himself right, and being right had never once made him feel anything except tired. 43 people had walked through that library door over those 22 years. 43 had seen the money. 43 had taken it. Some looked around first, some didn't bother. One woman had left a note beside the envelope that said, "God bless you," and taken the money anyway. Then, on that same cold Tuesday morning, Imani Caldwell walked through the door with a cleaning cart, and for the first time in 22 years, Wendell Beaumont lost his own test. Stay with me until the end, because what Wendell Beaumont wrote 18 words, handwritten on a separate sheet of paper, read last and alone at the will reading will leave even the attorneys in that room unable to speak. If this story already has you sitting a little straighter, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Atlanta, Memphis, Chicago, somewhere I've never heard of this story belongs to all of you. And if you believe that one quiet act of dignity can change the course of a life, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Imani opens that library door. Imani Caldwell was 41 years old, and she had not slept through a full night in 4 years and 3 months. That was how long it had been since the phone rang at 6:47 the morning, and a voice said words that rearranged every assumption she had ever carried about how her life was going to go. Her husband Curtis had died of a sudden cardiac event at 39 years old. No warning, no family history, nothing but a Thursday morning that went sideways before she had finished her first cup of coffee. The medical bills arrived and kept arriving for 2 years after that. By the time the hospitals and the emergency services and the cardiologist's office were finished billing her, Imani owed $34,217 in change. She paid what she could, which was $75 a month, which meant she would be paying it off until her daughter was grown and probably beyond. She cleaned houses for a living. Specifically, she cleaned the homes of people in Buckhead, the silk curtain, marble-floored, 4-car garage homes that sat behind electronic gates off West Pace's Ferry Road and Tuxedo Road and Blackland Drive. She was good at it, more than good. She had learned from her mother, who had learned from her mother before that, and there was knowledge in that lineage that no job listing could quantify. She knew how to treat antique wood and how to get a crystal chandelier to truly shine, and how to fold a fitted sheet with the precision of someone who understands that the small things are not small to the people they matter to. She earned $15.75 an hour. For the past 8 months, she had worked at Beaumont House, the estate of Wendell Beaumont, which sat at the end of a private drive off Pace's Ferry Road, surrounded by dogwood trees that were bare and skeletal in the January cold. The estate manager was a woman named Yvette Patterson, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and said exactly what she meant. On Imani's first day, Yvette had communicated 3 things with the clarity of a person who has given the same speech before. Arrive before 7:30, do not touch the library desk without specific instructions, and never let Mr. Beaumont sense that anything in his house was ever less than perfect. He was 72. He was exacting. He had let go of the previous housekeeper for leaving a water ring on a side table. This morning was a Tuesday in January. School was supposed to start at 8:15. At 6:02 a.m., Imani's phone buzzed with an automated message from Maple Creek Elementary. A water main had burst overnight in the cold. The building was out of service, All students were to remain home until further notice. Imani sat on the edge of her bed in the apartment she shared with her daughter on Gordon Road in West End, and she counted her options. She had zero. A babysitter cost $12 an hour minimum, and she had already spent her last non-essential dollar on her daughter's winter coat the previous November. She called the one friend who kept a flexible schedule. The call went to voicemail. She sat there with the phone in her hand, doing the arithmetic of a life with no margins, and then she called Yvette Patterson. It took some convincing. Yvette's silence on the line carried weight. Eventually, she said, very quietly, "Bring her, keep her out of his way. If he sees that child in this house, you are both gone before noon." "I mean that, Imani. I understand. I need you to understand more completely than you currently do," Yvette said. "That man is not cruel. But he has arrangements he expects to be honored, and a child in his space is not something he has agreed to." "I understand," Imani said again. Her daughter was 7 years old and quiet by nature, careful in the way of children who have learned early that the world has edges. Imani dressed her in 2 layers, packed a book and a small drawing pad in her backpack, and knelt down before they left to look her daughter in the face. "We are going to Mr. Beaumont's house," she said. "You are going to sit in the corner I put you in, and you are going to be so quiet that he doesn't know you're there. Can you do that for me?" Her daughter nodded. "You are the most important thing in any building we walk into. You know that, right?" Another nod. They drove to Beaumont House in Imani's 2013 Nissan Sentra, which had 143,000 miles on it and a heating system that worked when it felt like it. Outside, West End was doing what West End did at 6:47 inches the morning, a solitary MARTA bus running Cascade Road, the smell of someone's kitchen 2 floors up already working on something that involved onions and a warm stove. The particular quality of Atlanta cold that felt less like cold than like the city, reminding you it had edges. By the time Imani turned onto Paces Ferry Road and the neighborhood changed its tone, no more corner stores, no more bus stops, just iron gates and clipped silence, the heater had finally decided to work. By 7:21 a.m., she had signed in, pulled on her uniform, and settled her daughter in a small corner of the laundry room with a folded blanket to sit on, a juice box, and a granola bar. She checked back on her once before beginning her room-by-room schedule. Then she went to work. Her mother had told her once, when Imani was 12, that she had tried to walk past an old woman sitting in the January cold on the front steps of their building without stopping. Her mother had taken her gently by the arm. "Cold is cold, baby. It doesn't know the difference between your block and theirs. You stop or you don't. That's the only question there is." Imani had stopped. She had been stopping ever since. There is something worth knowing about the work Imani did. Domestic workers, the housekeepers and caregivers and home service workers who maintain the households of American families were explicitly excluded from the labor protections established under the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. It was not an oversight. It was a deliberate political accommodation to Southern legislators who needed Black women in their homes to remain without recourse, without guaranteed overtime, without the safety nets extended to other workers. The protections have expanded and been revised in the decades since, but the gap has never fully closed. As of recent surveys, roughly 2.4 million domestic workers in the United States, the overwhelming majority of them women of color, still work without paid sick leave, without overtime certainty, without the cushion that most working Americans assume exists beneath them. Imani knew this not as policy but as texture, as the particular sensation of a Tuesday morning when the school calls and there is nothing between you and the day's consequences except how fast you can think. She moved through the house the way she always did, quietly, completely, without making a production of the effort. Wendell Beaumont had not always been this way. He grew up in Vine City, on the west side of Atlanta, in a neighborhood that people who did not know the city might describe simply as a working-class Black community, and which people who did know Atlanta understood as something more loaded than that, a neighborhood that had been redlined, underfunded, half demolished during the highway expansion years, and partially revived. And through all of it, the people who lived there had kept living, kept cooking and praying and raising children who went on to build things. Wendell's mother had worked double shifts at a commercial laundry on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. His father drove a produce truck for a grocery distributor for 31 years without missing a scheduled route. They had not had much of anything that could be measured in dollars. What they had was a conviction that showed up like furniture in every room of the house, the certainty that how you treat people is the only currency that actually compounds over time, the only investment that never fully loses value. Wendell took that conviction and built a business with it, or so he believed, at the time. He started Beaumont Transport Group in 1979 with $3,400 borrowed from his mother and a used International Harvester truck, he kept running through stubbornness and mechanical aptitude and the refusal to accept that the thing he was building was not possible. He ran a route from Atlanta down to Macon and back, hauling dry goods for small retailers who couldn't afford what the large distributors charged. By 1987, he had 11 trucks. By 1995, he had a regional presence across the Southeast and a hiring policy that made a point of bringing on drivers who had been turned away elsewhere. By 2004, Beaumont Transport Group went public, and Wendell Beaumont became the kind of man whose name appeared in the Atlanta Business Chronicle next to numbers with many zeros. His wife Josephine had been with him through all of it. Josephine, who had met him at Friendship Baptist Church when they were both 23, who had a laugh that filled a room the way sunlight fills a room from every angle, with no dark corners. Josephine, who had worked as a school librarian for 30 years and had always said that books were the first thing she had ever owned that nobody could take back. They had 3 children together, Victor, Selena, and Adrian. They had been, for a long time, genuinely happy. Josephine died on a Wednesday afternoon in March 19 years ago of complications from late-stage kidney disease. She was 61. Wendell sat beside her at Westside Medical Center and did not leave the room for the final 41 hours. Before she lost consciousness the last time, she looked at him with eyes that still held their full clarity and said what he had spent the following 19 years trying to obey and failing at. Don't let the money close you off, Wendell. Don't let it tell you that you're better than people. He had promised. He had not kept that promise. There had been, in Josephine's last good week, one afternoon Wendell thought about nearly every day. She had asked him to drive her slowly down Westview Drive, the street in southwest Atlanta where she had taught Sunday school for 14 years. She pointed at a little girl on the sidewalk selling candy bars for $1 apiece, writing every transaction in a small spiral notebook completely absorbed in her accounting, 9 years old, maybe 10. Josephine watched her from the car window. You see that? She said. 20 years ago, you were that little girl, Wendell, standing on the corner with a cardboard sign for your lemonade, writing down every sale in your mother's tablet. Don't you ever look at somebody and see less than what you once were? He had promised. And then the money had come. And with it, the suspicion. And with the suspicion, the tests. And he had spent 19 years looking at people like that little girl and seeing exactly the thing Josephine had asked him never to see. Victor, Selena, and Adrian had each been positioned in the company after their schooling. Victor spent 6 years maneuvering to control the board. Selena processed a wardrobe renovation through a subsidiary account and called it professional development. Adrian borrowed $340,000 from the family trust for a restaurant venture that lasted 14 months and had never raised the subject of repayment. They called their father on his birthday. They called it Thanksgiving. They called when they needed something. In the long silences between, Wendell had learned to fill the quiet with suspicion, because suspicion at least had the structure of activity. It gave him something to do. The test had begun 10 years after Josephine died. He did not name it that way to himself at first. He called it precaution. He called it the reasonable vigilance of a man who had made the mistake of trusting too openly. He would position the envelope, lower himself into the chair, close his eyes, and wait. 43 people over 22 years. A groundskeeper whose back pay he deliberately withheld to see if financial pressure would make him take the cash. A personal secretary invited to file documents in the library while he dozed. A caterer's assistant, a maintenance contractor, an art appraiser. Various members of the cleaning staff over the years. Most of them were ordinary people in tight circumstances. Every single one of them had taken the money. The median time from entering the room to reaching for the envelope was 9 minutes and 22 seconds. Wendell kept records of all 43, the way he kept logistics records. Date, time, amount taken, time elapsed. The column labeled result contained the same notation every time. This morning, he had set the scene at 7:48 a.m. The library smelled of old paper and wood polish, and the faint cedar smoke from the fire in the grate. And underneath those things, something else, the particular stillness of a room where money has been kept for a very long time. Outside, Atlanta's rare January cold had settled over the dogwood trees and turned the decorative pond out back into a flat plate of dull silver. He lowered himself into the armchair, pulled the cashmere throw off the side table onto his lap, and closed his eyes. He had placed the envelope $5,000 in 50s, folded inside a standard white envelope, top flap tucked but not sealed in the center of his field of peripheral vision. He waited. He heard a cart in the hallway. A steady, careful roll of wheels. Then the door. Imani pushed the cleaning cart into the library at 8:03 a.m. She had been assigning the library to early morning on Tuesdays for 8 months, not because it was difficult to clean, but because of the quality of silence it demanded. Every surface had a precise expectation. The bookshelves were organized by a system she had never entirely decoded. The brass fixtures had to be polished in a specific direction. The Persian rug had to be vacuumed against the grain from the east wall. But today the complication was immediate and human. Mr. Beaumont was in his chair. Imani paused in the doorway. In 8 months, she had never encountered him in the library during her morning rounds. Yvette had communicated his schedule as placing him in his upstairs study before 9. She stood there making a quick calculation: leave, come back later, risk throwing off her entire schedule. Or clean as quietly as a woman can clean, and trust that he would sleep through it. She chose to stay. She set the doorstop, left the cart just inside the threshold, and moved with the kind of deliberateness you develop over years of working in rooms where noise is not welcome. She began at the east wall, long-handled cloth. Steady, unhurried motion along the spines of the books without clinking anything. She worked her way toward the center of the room. That was when she saw the envelope on the side table. She saw it. She registered it the way anyone would who has been doing arithmetic. A few bills were visible at the envelope's open edge, 50s, crisp and certain, enough thickness to tell her roughly what was inside. She stood there for exactly 4 seconds. She counted them afterward, because she needed to know how long the question had lasted. 4 seconds of being 41 years old with $34 in checking and $34,217 in medical debt and a daughter sharing her room and 143,000 miles on a car with intermittent heat. 4 seconds with her right hand perfectly still at her side. Then she turned back to her dusting. It did not belong to her. She worked her way around the room methodically. When she had to pass close to the armchair, she moved slowly and kept her breathing even. That was when she noticed his hands. The fireplace heated the center of the room in a cone. The armchair sat in a corner beside the tall window, and cold crept in around the window frame the way cold always finds a way in. His hands were folded in his lap and the skin at his knuckles had gone to the grayish blue. That happens when circulation is slow and the air has a bite to it. Imani stopped. She stood there for just a moment, not deliberating, because there was nothing to deliberate. Her mother had already answered this question for her when she was 12 years old on a cold stoop in West End. She reached up to her shoulders and unzipped the cardigan she was wearing over her uniform. Pale green, $4.50, 8 years of interview days and first mornings. She folded it carefully. She draped it across the old man's hands, tucking it loosely around his knuckles the way you would tuck something around someone you did not want to disturb. She whispered, barely audible even to herself. Mama said cold is cold. Doesn't care what side of town you're on. Then she noticed the envelope. It had shifted on the table, one edge hovering just past the table's rim. She reached out with 2 fingers and guided it back toward the center, positioning it near the base of the lamp where it was stable. She went back to her work. She was finishing the north wall of shelves when she saw, on the floor near the armchair, a pen. A fine-point pen with a gold clip, the kind that was not purchased at a drugstore. She picked it up, wiped the barrel once with her cloth, and placed it precisely at the edge of the table where it looked as though it had always been. Then she returned to the cart and finished her round. I want to stay with this moment a little longer, because it is the most important moment in the story, not for its drama, but for its absence of drama. Imani Caldwell did not wrestle with herself when she saw that money. She did not have a grand moral reckoning. She simply did not take what was not hers. And she helped a cold man, and she put a pen back where it belonged. She did these things the way she did everything in that room, completely, quietly, without making a performance of her own goodness. The most honest kindness is the kind that costs you something and doesn't announce itself. Wendell had felt the cardigan settle over his hands. The cardigan was still warm from being worn. He could feel that through the fabric, a faint, residual warmth, the kind a garment carries for a while after someone has taken it off. She had been wearing it when she walked into the room. She had removed it and placed it on him. For a long moment, he did not know what to do with that information. In 22 years and 43 iterations of this test, no one had ever covered him. No one had ever looked at him and seen someone who needed something given to them. They looked at the table. They looked at the door. They made their calculations. He held still. He tracked her progress through the room by sound, the deliberate, practiced movement of someone who was exceptionally good at what they did. He felt the faint shift in air when she passed near his chair, the slight warmth of another person in proximity. He heard her reach the north wall. The room quieted down to just the fire and the clock over the mantel. He cracked his left eye open, just a slit. She was at the bookshelves with her back to him, moving along the spines with a cloth in a smooth, unhurried motion. The pale green cardigan was draped over his hands. He could see the envelope on the table, and then he looked more carefully, and he could see that it had shifted from where he'd placed it. Not gone, not opened, moved an inch toward the lamp, away from the edge. He closed his eye. He lay still for another 7 minutes. He heard her finish the last wall. He heard the quiet extension of the vacuum wand, the low hum along the baseboards. He heard her return to the cart. She was going to leave without a word, the way professionals leave rooms, finishing the job and withdrawing, taking nothing except what they'd brought in. He moved. Wendell was practiced at waking up irritably. He shifted in the chair with a deliberate grunt, fumbled for the armrest, and opened his eyes with the expression of a man who has been interrupted during the one thing he had been looking forward to all day. "What is this?" he said. It was not a question. Imani had stopped. She turned from the cart and looked at him, a direct, steady, measuring look. She had clearly considered this possibility. "I'm sorry to have disturbed you, Mr. Beaumont. I was scheduled for this room." "The room," he said, as if the word required examination. His gaze dropped to the pale green fabric over his hands. "Did you put this on me? Your hands look cold, sir." I didn't ask for anything on me." "No, sir." She didn't flinch. "I can take it back." He looked at her for a moment, a real look. The kind you give something that is not behaving the way you expected it to. Then his gaze moved to the table. The envelope was still there, repositioned, untouched. The pen was back in its place. Everything exactly as it should be, except that none of it had gone the way he'd planned. His eyes moved to the baseboard along the south wall, near the door. He had been in this library through 4 seasons and 19 years, and he knew every inch of it, including the faint discoloration on the wainscoting from a moisture issue the previous spring, barely visible unless you were looking. An inch and a half of faded shadow at the base of the paneling. He pointed at it. "That's damage." Imani turned to look. She was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a woman who is examining a situation carefully before she responds to it. "Sir, I don't believe that wainscoting is original to this house. Heart Pine, 1926. You cannot replicate the patina. Remediation costs $600 at minimum." He watched her face. A specialist would have to come out. She ran the numbers the way she always ran numbers, automatically, before she could stop herself. $600 was 38 hours of work before taxes. It was 8 months of medical debt payments. It was the winter coat she had been telling herself she would buy since November. Her face did not collapse. It did something more difficult than collapsing. It settled, like a person who has received the kind of news they half expected and have already decided how they are going to stand under it. "I understand," she said. "I didn't cause that, but I understand. Please deduct it from my wages. Your wages don't cover $600 in a month. Then deduct it across as many months as it takes." She paused, and in the pause he could hear everything she was not saying, the effort and the steadiness. The fact that steadiness was what it was. "I need this job, Mr. Beaumont. I will cover whatever you say I owe." He looked at her. Then, just briefly, his gaze shifted past her shoulder to the corner of the room behind her cart where, sitting on a folded blanket with a book open on her knees, a small girl sat absolutely motionless. She was looking at Wendell with dark, careful eyes that held neither fear nor accusation, just attention. The particular attention of a child who has learned that stillness is a reasonable response when adults are conducting business. Wendell looked at the child. The child looked at Wendell. "There is a child in my library," he said. Imani moved half a step to the left, positioning herself between Wendell and her daughter without making it look like positioning. "Yes, sir. Her school had a water main emergency. I had no one to leave her with. She has been in that corner since 8/4 without moving or making a sound or touching anything in this room. I take full responsibility." He looked at the girl again. She had not moved. Her hands were folded in her lap over the open book, as if she had paused mid-page when his voice entered the room and had decided to wait until she understood the situation before she went on. Something shifted in Wendell's chest that he had not anticipated and did not know how to name. He looked away from the child. $600, he said again. "For the wainscoting." Imani nodded once. She did not let her hands shake. She had learned, in the 4 years and 3 months since Curtis died, that visible trembling was a cost she could not always afford, that it invited a particular kind of concern that had a way of turning into pity, and pity had a way of turning into condescension. She had learned instead to breathe once, slowly, through the nose, and then proceed. She set down the handle of the cart. She reached for her shoulder bag, which was hanging from the cart side hook, a wide canvas bag in dark brown, worn smooth at the handles from years of daily use. She opened it with unhurried hands and looked inside for a moment, in the way of someone doing arithmetic they already know the answer to. She pulled out a pale blue envelope. It was sealed and had a rubber band around it. When she set it on the table, Wendell could see that several bills were visible through the unsealed corner and that each bill had a small date written in pencil on its upper edge. The date she had set it aside. The dates went back to February 14th of the winter before last, written in careful numerals, going bill by bill through months she had managed to save $20. She had written the date every single time. She had needed to see it accumulating. She held it in both hands for just a moment. Then she set it on the edge of the library table, a careful foot away from Wendell's larger envelope. $847, she said. I've been saving since the winter before last. $20 from every paycheck. I was going to use it for a security deposit on a 2-bedroom apartment. So my daughter doesn't have to share a room with me anymore. She looked at the envelope she had placed on the table. Then she looked back at him. I don't know if that covers a specialist for wainscoting, but it's all I have that isn't already committed to something else. A pause. I've also got $34 in checking, but that's gas for the week. I need the car. She reached up to the collar of her uniform. There was a thin chain there, almost invisible against the fabric. She unclasped it carefully. On the end of the chain was a small gold cross, no bigger than a thumbnail, not fine jewelry, not the kind of thing that would mean anything to an appraiser. But it was old, and the gold had gone warm with years of being worn next to skin. This was my mother's, she said. She set it on the table beside her envelope, on the side closer to him. She called it her anchoring cross. Said as long as you had one thing to hold on to, you couldn't drift too far. She looked at it for a moment. I've worn it every day for 11 years. I don't know what it's worth at a jeweler. You can have it if the money doesn't cover the cost. Her expression, in that moment, was the only indication of what it cost her to say the next sentence. I'd rather lose it to something real than to something I can't account for. The room was very quiet. Wendell Beaumont looked at the 2 envelopes on his table, his, which held $5,000, and hers, which held $847 in bills with handwritten dates on their corners. He looked at the small gold cross. He looked at the woman standing across from him with her hands folded in front of her, not wringing, not trembling. The posture of a person who has decided where they stand and intends to stay there. He had sat across from people in difficult situations for 50 years of doing business. He had watched employees who were afraid, contractors who were desperate, people in genuine financial distress try everything they had: charm, anger, tears, logic, appeals to his history, appeals to their history to move him. No one had ever placed everything they owned in front of him and left it there without commentary. In Wendell's chest, something gave way. Not dramatically. It felt more like a seam loosening something that had been held closed for a very long time, tightening a little more every year, and was now simply no longer able to hold. He thought of Josephine. He thought of the little girl on Westview Drive, writing dates in her notebook. He thought of what he had built, instead of keeping his promise a methodology, a ritual, a 22-year project of confirming what he had already decided to believe. He thought of the 43 people before this woman. He had filed every one of them under the same heading, proof of his conclusion. He had never once considered that a filing system can be the problem rather than the answer. He looked at her daughter in the corner. The girl was watching him with those careful, unhurried eyes, and something in her stillness hit him with a sharpness he had not expected. He thought of his mother. He thought of Josephine. He thought of every woman who had carried a life that demanded more than it gave and had done so without making the cost of that visible, because they had decided that their job was to carry it, and his job and the job of men like him was apparently to not notice. Wendell reached up with one hand and took the pale green cardigan from his hands. He held it for a moment. He could still feel the warmth in it. It was thin at the elbows, soft from many washings, carefully kept. I have a confession to make, he said. He cleared his throat and said it again the same way, because there was no other way to say it. I was not asleep. Imani did not speak. I arranged this room deliberately. He touched the edge of his own envelope, the money where anyone coming in could reach it. The chair angled so I could track the table without opening my eyes. I have done this 43 times over 22 years. Everyone before you took the money. He paused. Every single one. He looked at her steadily. You covered my hands with your cardigan. You moved the envelope back from the edge of the table. You put the pen back. And now you have placed 3 years of savings, every bill dated by hand, and your mother's anchoring cross on my table to pay for damage I invented. The fire in the grate popped once. The clock over the mantel continued its count. Why the test? Imani said after a moment. Not angry. Genuinely asking, in the voice of a woman who has sat with difficult questions before and is not afraid of the answer. Because I stopped believing. His voice was quieter than he expected it to be. After my wife died, after I watched my children learn to treat money as the only real language, I started seeing everyone the same way, as a transaction waiting to happen, as someone calculating when my back would be turned. He looked at the envelope. I made everyone into a thief before they had a chance to be anything else. Imani was quiet for a moment. My mother used to say cold is cold, she said. It doesn't know your address. It doesn't know what's in your wallet. She said that was why you can't decide not to notice it, because deciding not to notice it is still a decision, and decisions have a way of becoming who you are. She paused. She also used to say that when you spend long enough looking for something specific, you usually find it. And sometimes that's the problem. Wendell Beaumont looked at a woman who earned $15.75 an hour and had placed $847 in hand-dated bills and her mother's anchoring cross on his table to pay for invented damage, and who was now offering him, instead of anger, a sentence of quiet and precise truth. He had thought he was conducting the test. He understood now, for the first time, that she had been the one revealing who he was. He slid both envelopes toward her. Take it. Imani looked at the larger envelope and shook her head. That's your money, she said. It's a reward. For what you, Mr. Beaumont. Her voice was even and final. I didn't do any of those things to earn a reward. I did them because that's how I am. I don't want money that came from a test. She picked up her small pale blue envelope, tucked it back in her bag. She reclasped her mother's anchoring cross at her collar. I'll accept an apology for the $600 in damage I didn't do. It was, perhaps, the first time in 19 years that Wendell Beaumont found himself without a next move. He sat with that for a moment. The fire crackled. The clock continued. I'm sorry, he said. And then, because it was the first time he had said those words about this particular subject, he said them again, more carefully. I am genuinely sorry. She nodded. All right. He looked at her for a long moment. Then let me offer something else. Not from the test, from this conversation. What would that be? My granddaughter attends Cornerstone Academy on Powers Ferry Road, he said. I have a relationship with their admissions office. If your daughter qualifies on her own merits, I would like to cover her enrollment. He held up one hand before she could speak. I am not asking you to be grateful. I am asking you to let me make one decision today that is worth making. Imani turned to look at her daughter in the corner, who had returned to her book at some point during the conversation and was now reading with the total absorption of a child who has no particular interest in what adults decide. She would need to apply, Imani said. She would need to qualify on her own. I would expect nothing else. And I would need it to be clear, in whatever arrangement exists, that it is her achievement and not a gift. Agreed. She looked at him once more. That measuring look that he was beginning to understand was simply the face of a person deciding whether a situation was worth trusting. All right, she said. It was the beginning of something neither of them had a name for yet. In the months that followed, the arrangement expanded in ways that had not been negotiated. It was less a transaction than an accumulation. Within 3 months, Yvette Patterson promoted Imani to senior household coordinator, not at Wendell's instruction, but because the work warranted it and Yvette had been watching for months. The raise brought Imani to $19.50 an hour. Separately, Wendell had the estate's accountant contact the hospitals and medical providers who held Imani's debt. The $34,217 balance, which had grown to $38,440 with accumulated interest, was settled in full. Wendell did not mention it to Imani directly. She found out when she called to make her $75 monthly payment and was told the account had a zero balance. She came to the library that afternoon and knocked on the open door frame. He was at his desk. He looked up. You paid my medical debt, she said. I did. I didn't ask you to. No. He picked up his pen. You wouldn't have. That was exactly the point. She stood in the doorway for a moment, working through something visible in the set of her shoulders, the particular discomfort of receiving a significant kindness when you have been the person providing rather than receiving for a very long time. Thank you, she said. You're welcome, he said. I'm going to go back to this now. She went back to work. Victor, Selena, and Adrian Beaumont did not notice the change in the house at first. They visited on the occasions when absence would have been conspicuous: his birthday, Thanksgiving, the anniversary of Josephine's death. They were polite and watchful in the way of people who have a significant financial stake in someone's continued good health. They noticed the house felt different, more inhabited, a different quality to the air, but they did not investigate. They asked about the business. They did not ask about their father. Wendell observed this and said nothing. He had begun leaving his study door open on the mornings when Imani and her daughter arrived. He had given the girl access to the library, after hours and on Saturdays, with the condition that every book be returned to its exact position. She did this with such precision that he began to suspect she had been taught to love order the way he had been taught to love it, as an expression of respect for things that matter. He helped with homework the first time by accident. She was at the library table working through a multiplication problem, made a small, frustrated sound, and Wendell, who was passing through for a book, stopped and looked over her shoulder and said, "You're carrying in the wrong column," and sat down. 40 minutes later, they had covered multiplication, short division, and the concept of remainders, and he had not noticed the time passing. He had not noticed time passing in that particular way in many years. He started appearing in the library on Saturdays. He taught her fractions and then the fundamentals of a balance sheet, because she had asked what he did all day and he'd said, "Run a business," and she had said, "How do you know if it's working?" And he had thought about it and decided it was an excellent question that deserved a real answer. He told Imani one afternoon, when they were both in the library and her daughter was in the garden with Yvette. She asks the question underneath the question. "I know," Imani said without emphasis, "in the way you say something that has been true for a long time." Her father, Wendell, said carefully, "You mentioned he was a reader." He was. She was quiet for a moment. He drove freight, regional carrier out of Decatur. He applied to Beaumont Transport once, about 8 years ago. Wendell was still. Did he? He didn't get called back. He found a good position at Kellerman Southeast. It was fine. She paused. He was gone 2 years after that. The fact of it sat between them for a while, the strange geometry of the paths that had led two people from Vine City and West End, and the roads in between to this particular room at this particular time. "I'm sorry," Wendell said. "About all of it." "I know," she said. And she seemed to mean both things, that she knew about the regret and that the regret was received. The accumulation continued. By the third year, Imani was estate director, overseeing all operations of Beaumont House. By the fourth year, Wendell had quietly established the Josephine Beaumont Foundation, named for his wife, designed to provide housing support, childcare access, and professional advancement to single working mothers in Atlanta. He offered Imani the director position. She negotiated the salary before she accepted. He respected this enormously. By the sixth year, her daughter was enrolled at a magnet high school on a merit scholarship she had earned independently, and Wendell had attended every school event he was invited to. He sat in the bleachers and in the auditorium seats with the contained pride of a man who is slightly confused by how much he cares and has decided not to examine it too closely. His 3 biological children, over the years, had grown more distant. Not in hostility, but in the natural way of people whose interests have diverged completely from the person they are supposed to be connected to. They called on the occasions when they called. They asked about his health in the way that contains, underneath it, a different question. Wendell answered the surface question and let the other one wait. Wendell Beaumont died on a Sunday morning in early March. In the 7th year after the January Tuesday when Imani Caldwell had walked into his library with a cleaning cart, he died in the burgundy leather chair. Not dramatically. He had gone into the library at 6:30 inches the morning, as he sometimes did when sleep became theoretical. When Yvette brought his coffee at 9:47 a.m., he had already gone. His face was relaxed. His hands were in his lap. On the side table, neatly placed, was the pale green cardigan. He had kept it in a flat display case on the library shelf for 6 years. The year before he died, he had taken it out and placed it on the side table instead. He had never explained why to anyone. He did not need to. The gathering at Beaumont House 3 days later was formal in the front parlor and quietly tense in the hallways. Victor, Selena, and Adrian occupied the front row with the focused stillness of people who have done preliminary calculations. Imani sat near the back with her daughter, who was 14 now, and wore her school blazer and held her mother's hand. The attorney, a measured man named Reginald who had worked with Wendell for many years, began reading. "To my children, Victor, Selena, and Adrian, I leave you the trust funds established in 1992 and amended in 2003. These represent what I believe I owe you for the years I prioritized the company over the family, and for arriving too late to the understanding that showing up for people costs something and is worth paying. I hope these funds serve you better than I knew how to." Victor looked at Selena. Selena looked at Adrian. "Regarding the remainder of the estate Beaumont House, the holdings, the investment portfolio, and the operating interests of Beaumont Transport Group, these are directed in full to the Josephine Beaumont Foundation, whose mission is the one my wife spent her life working toward, making sure the people who keep things running are not the ones left behind when the running is over." There was a murmur in the room. The foundation's executive director is Imani Caldwell, whose tenure in that role I expect and recommend to continue for as long as she finds it. Beaumont House is to be converted into the foundation's permanent operating home. Victor stood up. Adrian put a hand on his arm. Reginald held up one finger and continued. Mr. Beaumont also left a letter for the gathering. He requested it be read aloud. He unfolded a second sheet handwritten, in the angular script Imani had seen on logistics memos and homework notes and birthday cards over 7 years. I spent the middle years of my life building a system to protect myself from being disappointed by people. I was very successful at it. I was less successful at noticing that the wall I built to keep the disappointment out also kept the warmth out, and that you cannot selectively filter one without losing the other. I grew up in Vine City believing that how you treat people is the only currency that actually compounds. I don't know exactly when I stopped believing that. I know it cost me more than I can calculate, and I know I got it back later than I should have, from a direction I had no reason to expect. On a cold Tuesday morning in January, a woman walked into my library with a cleaning cart. She covered my cold hands with the cardigan off her back. She repositioned my money so it would not fall to the floor. She offered me 3 years of savings, every bill dated in her own handwriting, and her mother's anchoring cross to pay for damage I'd invented. She did these things without an audience and without an expectation of return, which is the only kind of goodness that is actually goodness. She was the 44th person I tested. She was the only one who passed. She was also the only one who refused the reward, which meant she was the only one who taught me what I actually needed to learn, that the goodness of a person has nothing to do with whether someone is watching. I am leaving her the tools to do at scale what she has always done at the individual level, to take care of people the way she has always taken care of people, except now with a house and a foundation and a seat at whatever table she decides belongs in this building. To Imani, I hope it is useful. I hope it is a fraction as useful as you were to me. Thank you for covering my hands. You were right that they were cold. They had been cold for a very long time. Reginald set the letter down. He picked up a third, smaller piece of paper, a half sheet, torn from a notepad, the kind of paper you reach for when the thought is urgent enough that you do not go looking for stationery. He said, Mr. Beaumont left this separately, not part of the will, not part of the letter. He asked that it be read last, and alone. The room was completely still. Reginald read it slowly, the way you read something when you understand that the room needs to hear each word individually. 18 words. She found $5,000 on my table and chose to cover my hands. That is the story. Adrian said quietly, we will consult our attorneys. Reginald nodded. You are entitled to do that. The will was prepared by a firm of 7 attorneys, witnessed by 3 independent parties, and Mr. Beaumont recorded a video statement confirming his full understanding of its terms. I expect any challenge would have a very long road. The 3 Beaumont children looked at one another. Then they walked toward the door. Victor went first. Adrian followed. Selena stopped at the doorframe. She turned back not to the attorney, not to her brothers, but to Imani. She looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not anger exactly, but something older and more complicated than anger. He talked about that chair, she said quietly. Every time we called, for years. We never understood why. She waited a beat, as if she might say something more. Then her hand moved briefly to the strap of her bag, and she turned and walked out. Her footsteps faded down the hallway. The room went quiet. Reginald looked at Imani. There is one more item. Mr. Beaumont asked that this be given to you at the reading. He set a flat display case on the table. Inside, on a square of white cloth, was the pale green cardigan, the one she had bought for $4.50 from a Goodwill on Metropolitan Parkway and worn on interview days for 8 years. Wendell had placed a small card against the glass, in his handwriting, the warmth that was not required but was given anyway. Imani stood for a long time with the case in her hands. She was not thinking about Beaumont House. She was not thinking about the foundation or the holdings or the legal architecture of the will. She was thinking about a Tuesday morning in January, about a man sitting in a chair with cold hands, about a cardigan she had unzipped without deliberating because her mother had answered this question for her when she was 12 years old on a stoop in West End, and the answer had never changed. Her daughter came to stand beside her. They looked at the case together. He was a good man, her daughter said. She was 14 and had known him since she was 7, and she said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time. He just needed someone to start him. Yes, Imani said, you started him. Imani put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. I covered his hands. He did the rest. In the years that followed, Beaumont House became something the neighborhood had not quite expected, a place where women came in the morning and left in the afternoon with a resource they hadn't had the day before. A connection to legal aid for a housing dispute, a referral to affordable childcare that matched their schedule, a job placement that matched their skills to an opening that didn't advertise in the usual places. A conversation with someone at a clean desk in a well-lit room who had been where they were and did not treat that fact as something to move past quickly. Imani kept her office in the small room off the back hallway, the one that had been a butler's pantry, the one with the window that looked onto the garden. It was not a grand space. It suited her. On the wall behind her desk was one photograph, taken in the library 7 years before Wendell died. He and her daughter were bent together over the library table, her daughter pointing at something on the page, Wendell leaning in to look. Both of them holding the full concentration of people in the middle of solving a problem that matters. Imani had taken it on her phone one afternoon when she came in with tea and saw them. Neither of them had looked up. They had never known the picture existed until after he was gone. Her daughter, by then a student at Spelman College, had stood in front of it a long time at the foundation's opening. He was teaching me remainders, she said. I know, Imani said. I still use that method. I know that too, Imani said. She put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and they stood there together in a house that had been built on suspicion and then rebuilt on something else, something that had started on a cold morning with a pale green cardigan and an old man's hands that were, in fact, very cold. Cold is cold, her mother used to say. It doesn't know what's in your wallet. It doesn't know the address. It only waits to see what you will do about it. This is a work of fiction, but it is built from the real conditions of real people. Domestic workers in the United States, the housekeepers and caregivers who maintain American households, were explicitly excluded from the federal labor protections established in 1938. That exclusion was not an accident. It was a concession to Southern legislators who needed Black domestic workers to remain without recourse. The full protections have still not been extended. As of recent surveys, approximately 2.4 million domestic workers in the United States, the majority of them women of color, still work without paid sick leave or reliable overtime protections. Medical debt is the leading driver of personal bankruptcy in the United States. Black American households carry this burden disproportionately. Research from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that Black Americans are nearly 3 times as likely as white Americans to have medical debt in collections. A sudden death, one bad night in an emergency room. These events can determine a decade of financial stability for a family that had none to spare. I wrote this story because I believe the woman with the cleaning cart deserves to be the center of the story, not the background of someone else's transformation. Imani was already good before Wendell noticed. She will be good after this story ends. The revelation was his, not hers, and I think that distinction matters more than we usually say out loud. Tell me in the comments, have you ever done something kind when no one was watching, something that actually cost you something and never expected it to come back? What was it? Where are you watching from tonight? If this story reached you, share it with one person who needs to hear that their quiet dignity is seen, even when it feels like it isn't. Like it, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and turn on notifications so stories like this one find you when you need them. Stay kind, stay blessed, and never underestimate the power of one quiet act of love.